Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the poem Poppies by Jane Weir. So as always we start with the poet and we're looking at details from the poet's life that help us to understand the poem itself. This is Jane Weir. She was born in 1963, grew up in Italy and England, lived in Northern Ireland during the 1980s, so experienced some of the troubles there, and is a textile designer as well as a poet, and that's very important for this poem because there's a lot of imagery related to textiles and that helps us understand where it comes from. That's the same with all of Jane Weir's poetry. Nice quotation about her as a poet. The principal motive is language itself, its mutability in representing both the abstract or the real. And I think that's a great quotation from a critic which really does capture what is so nice about Jane Weir's poetry is the use of language and how it has two different sides to it. It can be both very domestic and sort of ordinary, but also filled with a deeper meaning, which is exactly what we see in this poem. A little bit about the context of the the poem I should say. It comes from a collection which Carol Ann Duffy put together in 2009 called Exit Wounds. And this was all about war. As a way of trying to understand the suffering that war causes, Carol Ann Duffy asked a number of writers, 10 in total, to write poems. And that included Jane Weir. And Duffy said, "Today, as most of us do, poets largely experience war, wherever it rages, through emails or texts from friends or colleagues in war zones, through radio or newsprint or television, through blogs or tweets or interviews. With the official inquiry into Iraq imminent and the war in Afghanistan returning dead teenagers to the streets of Wootton Bassett, I invited a range of my fellow poets to bear witness, each in their own way, to these matters of war." So that's about the context. Now, Jane Weir herself said, "I wrote the piece from a woman's perspective, which is quite rare. As the mother of two teenage boys, I tried to put across how I might feel if they were fighting in a war zone. I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a mother and her relationship with her son, a child who was loved, cherished and protected, and it had led to this, heightened and absolute fear that parents experience in letting their children go, the anxiety and ultimately the pain of loss. I hoped to somehow channel all this, convey it into something concise and contemporary, but also historically classic in terms of universal experience." So the historical context that we need to understand then, poppies. What do we mean by poppies? Well, Armistice Sunday began as a way of marking the end of the First World War in 1918, and it was set up so people could remember the hundreds and thousands of ordinary men who'd been killed in the First World War. Today, the event is used to remember soldiers of all wars who have died since then. Now, in terms of the poem, there are different views about the plot of this poem, but as I've said in lots of videos, it really doesn't matter exactly nailing it down to perfect detail about what is going on in the storyline of the poem. We don't actually want to analyse what's going on. We want to analyse how the poet uses language, structure and form to create meaning. So don't worry too much about whether this is a poem about... Well, I'll give a few ideas later, but the actual storyline of the poem isn't important. And I think in terms of a power and conflict poem, we could say that it looks at the pain and suffering of those left behind. The domestic conflict caused by national conflict, like kamikaze, the impact of war on those at home as well as on those going to war, like War Photographer. So it's still about the impact of conflict, but it's giving a voice to those left behind, in this case, the mother. Okay, let's analyse language, structure, form. To begin with the form, this is a dramatic monologue. Weir is writing in character. She's not writing about her own personal experience, and she is addressing a silent listener, the you, the son, the soldier. So a dramatic monologue is a form of poetry where the poet takes on the persona of a character, speaking to somebody else, direct address of the word you, but we never hear from the person being spoken to. Their voice is silent. So why use a dramatic monologue form? Why don't we hear anything from the son? Well, a number of ideas, and you can add your own as well, but it does emphasize how this poem is about the pain caused for the often ignored mother. So we're actually saying, look, all of this thing about war, we're not even going to consider the soldier for a second. We're thinking about those left behind. And that's represented through the dramatic monologue form, which doesn't consider the soldier. Also, of course, it emphasizes how he's not there. The fact that we don't hear his voice is because he's not there. He's either off at war or perhaps in some interpretations he's died. What about the structure? A number of things take place with the structure that I think are worth analysing. And as I've been doing recently with the poems, there are some kind of generic overarching points which we see throughout the poem, and then we'll look at some specifics. So the poem is written in free verse. There's no sort of organised rhyme scheme or structure to the poem. And it's also got stanzas of totally different lengths, which again is this kind of chaotic structure. There's enjambment, where the sentences flow onto the next line and even the next stanza. And there's a lot of caesura, where punctuation makes within the line makes the reader stop and pause. These are all techniques you should be familiar with if you've watched the other poetry analyses videos, which are all in my playlist, so make sure you check them out. So what can we say about this? Well, I think all of these combine for a chaotic structure. It's really not ordered or controlled, and that reflects the chaotic impact of conflict on those at home. Their life is chaos. It lacks control or organisation because they are completely absorbed with the terrifying thoughts about those loved ones who are serving in war. A couple of specific points. I mean, I think the enjambment here between stanzas, where it says, all my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. So this sentence continues not only onto the next line, but a whole new stanza. And what can we say about that? Well, Jane Weir herself said that if one is to grieve, one has to at some point let it dissolve. And the structure here breaks. And I think the break in structure reflects how the mother is breaking emotionally, and it's emphasized through a stanza break between within a sentence, the enjambment, because it's reflecting the break in emotions of the mother. Now, one of the things that's really interesting here to do with the language is the use of domestic language. And there's a great quotation from Jane Weir before we jump into the examples of language, where she said, appropriating and applying the language of the too often condemned domestic front is, I suppose, a political act. And I think what is absolutely fascinating about Weir's use of language, and it comes back to the critic's quote at the beginning, is the way that she uses very domestic, everyday, ordinary imagery, but infuses in it the rich metaphor and simile and imagery of war and suffering to suggest just how those left behind at home in civilian life feel. So I'm going to go through a number of images which can be seen in two ways, both domestic and military. And this constant and overwhelming use of this kind of image is in itself a structural point about how overwhelming the feelings of dread are for the mother. I'm just going to explore a few. You can put comments in the comment section about some of the others, because what we don't want to do in the exam is make a point and then make the same point again and then make the same point again. So any of these serve as a really good example. So first off, talking about the son's yellow blazer. When I Google image searched yellow blazer, every image was of a woman wearing one, so it took me a while to find one. But we have this description of spasms of paper red disrupting a blockade of yellow bias. Now, what's happening here in the literal terms is the son has got a yellow lapel on his blazer and the mum is pinning a poppy on it. But the use of the word spasm, of course, is a word of injury and makes us think about sort of pain and suffering. And blockade is a war-related word. It means to isolate or close off a place, and it's being closed off by hostile troops to prevent entrance or exit. That's what a blockade is. It's a war word. So we have the blending of a very domestic image with a war image, which reflects how the mother is seeing all of these ideas of suffering in everyday life. She can't, the ideas of conflict are overwhelming her. The next one is sellotape bandaged around my hand. Have you ever done this when you've got like dog hair on you or fluff? You just wrap sellotape around your hand and then you tap yourself and it gets it off. So all she's doing in literal terms is defluffing his clothes. But of course the word bandaged is a word that we would relate to suffering and wound, and perhaps a wounded soldier comes to mind. Graze my nose. What she actually wants to do is to kiss him by rubbing her nose up against his, the sort of Eskimo kiss. But of course, like bandaged, the word graze is a word of suffering and conflict. Reinforcements of scarf and gloves. These are just clothes to keep warm, but described with the military word of reinforcements, extra troops being sent. And even the dove, which seems like a very positive image, there are two interpretations of a dove. It is a symbol of peace, but it's also a symbol of mourning. So we have again the conflicting emotions. Now I'm whizzing through these because I want to make the overall point, which is that the constant blending of domestic and military language shows how this sort of suffering of her son, or the idea of her son in the conflict zone, is constantly on the speaker's mind. It's in everything she sees and does. And that's quite interesting because this poem forces us to think about the impact of conflict on those who aren't even there. And here's another image. I was brave. This challenges our preconceived ideas about conflict. It makes us think of how we would expect this to be said by the soldier, but the mother is saying it. And it hammers home the point that war has a huge impact on those left at home in the civilian sphere. There is one moment where the mother retells the story from the son's perspective. Doesn't use his voice, but sort of gives us an image of what he's thinking. The world overflowing like a treasure chest is a simile. And it shows the son's sense of excitement at leaving home, perhaps a childish image as well, which suggests he doesn't have realistic expectations. And when she then describes him as intoxicated, it suggests that perhaps he's not making a measured and controlled decision, but he's got sort of caught up in the excitement of everything. So what is this poem saying? Well, conflict is not just experienced by those at war, in literal conflict zones. It's also experienced by those at home in the civilian world. And we see a taste of that in Kamikaze and War Photographer as well. Please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and do watch the other videos in the playlist.